In the deep hollows of the misty mountains and in the dark corners beneath the sky, many tales of the Uruk-Hai's creation swirled like foul whispers carried by a bitter wind. Legends spoke of their birth in slimy pits near Isengard, shaped by the cunning hand of Saruman the White, who lusted for power beyond all reason. They marched under his banner, savage and unyielding, carrying twisted blades and cruel bows as they spread terror across the lands of Rohan and beyond. Yet in the quiet hours when fires smoldered low and their captains argued over spoils, the Uruk-Hai whispered among themselves a forbidden idea. What if they need not heed the voice of Saruman? Some claimed that if Saruman's will had cracked open a door to their independence, then the might of their own arms could fling it wide, for who was stronger than they? Such notions at first drifted like embers from a dying flame, glowing faintly before winking out, for fear of the wizard's wrath, or perhaps even of the eye in the east. But as the fires of war raged on, and the white wizard proved vulnerable to the meddling of hobbits, ents, and men, the spark of rebellion began to burn more fiercely in the hearts of these brutal soldiers. And so this tale unfolds, how the Uruk-Hai cast off their shackles, usurping the Tower of Orthanc, forging a new kingdom built upon iron, black stone, and the savage voice of freedom. Their first bold stirrings began after the defeats suffered at Helm's Deep, where many of their kin had been slain by the riders of Rohan. The survivors limped back to Isengard, battered and broken, only to find Saruman's temper burning hotter than the forges beneath Orthanc. Whips cracked upon wounded flesh, and cruel words fell from the wizard's lips, condemning the Uruk-Hai for their failures as though they were tools gone faulty rather than living creatures of flesh and bone. It was in these moments of humiliating chastisement that a seed of resentment was planted. Some among them saw in Saruman not an all-knowing master but a flawed tyrant. They glowered at the white wizard from beneath their heavy brows, fists tightening on hilt and haft, feeling how strongly their own sinews still stretched beneath their dark skin. In the shadows of Isengard's foundries, fresh alliances were formed in quiet hushes, pledging loyalty not to the wizard but to the might of the Uruk-Hai themselves. One bold captain, the largest among them, whose eyes glowed like hot coals, gathered others in hidden alcoves to speak words of mutiny. He argued that Saruman had gambled their lives recklessly, and the white wizard's judgment was clouded by his obsession with the One Ring. Fury built like a rising tide, and soon, unbeknownst to the robed watchers or the lesser orcs who scurried about the outer walls, the Uruk-Hai nursed a gathering storm of insurrection. At the heart of Isengard stood Orthanc, a spire carved from black stone so hard that no mortal tools could scratch it. Saruman took comfort in its seeming invulnerability, for he believed that from its heights he could peer across Middle-earth and weave his subtle manipulations. He seldom noticed the small changes, how some of the Uruk-Hai stood guard at the gates longer than necessary, whispering dark words behind closed teeth. Nor did he see how certain forges worked late into the night, forging not the usual swords meant for his armies, but heavier blades and cruel axes that would never be catalogued in his ledgers. But Grima Wormtongue, lurking in shadows with a sly glimmer in his eye, gleaned tidbits of the rebellious talk, though he dared not confront the Uruk-Hai directly. He was no stranger to conspiracies and subterfuge, having practiced them at the court of King Theoden, and he harbored his own desires for influence. Yet even he sensed the raw power that seethed among the ranks of the Uruk-Hai, a force that would sooner snap his neck than abide his cunning words if he meddled too much. So he weighed his options, uncertain whether Saruman's wrath was more fearsome than the unstoppable might of the Uruk-Hai, who were now awakening to their own destiny. The final spark that ignited the rebellion came in the form of a grim errand. Saruman, frantic over rumors of hobbits bearing the One Ring, sent out an elite troop of Uruk-Hai into the Westfold, commanding them to bring back news at any cost. They returned after skirmishes with Rohirrim scouts and uneasy brushes with men from Gondor, carrying wounded pride and battered shields. Saruman greeted them not with gratitude, but with furious chastisement, calling them useless beasts who could not handle the most basic tasks. Before the assembled guards, he struck one Uruk-Hai captain across the face, sending the warrior reeling into a brazier of hot coals. That single act, as the Uruk-Hai howled in pain and anger, shattered the last vestige of patience among the watchers. Their fists clenched, their hearts pounded, and a shared rage unified them in a way that Saruman had not anticipated. The wizard's white robe swirled as he turned away in contempt, unaware that he had unleashed a fury that would change the fate of Isengard forever. The days leading up to the coup were etched with tension. Uruk-Hai guards stationed high on the walls listened keenly for any sign that Saruman suspected their plot, while those below toiled at the forging of weapons in secret corners of the cavernous armories. The air within Isengard grew heavy, tinged with the metallic scent of sword oil and an undercurrent of impending violence. Some lesser orcs, who once bowed low before the White Wizard, found themselves cornered by hulking Uruk-Hai demanding fealty to a new order. Those who resisted were swiftly silenced, their bodies never to be found, and those who yielded scurried about with wide eyes, eager to prove their loyalty to these newly emboldened masters. Over the ramparts of Isengard, the banners of the White Hand still fluttered in the breeze, but many of the Uruk-Hai began to spit upon that symbol. Among themselves, they swore oaths of brotherhood, vowing that the hand on their armor would soon be their own black hand, not that of Saruman's. The new leader among them, the towering captain with coal-like eyes, had taken upon himself the name Gashluk, meaning flame-fong in their guttural tongue. His roar, deep and resonant, inspired a fervor among his kin, and they clutched their weapons with an almost religious zeal. When the night of the uprising finally arrived, thick clouds cloaked the moon, leaving the courtyard of Isengard in near-total darkness. Saruman, preoccupied with gazing into the palantir and obsessing over the movements of the Fellowship, did not notice the slow encirclement of Uruk-Hai warriors around the base of Orthanc. Gashluk led the charge, stepping forth with a massive hammer forged in secret, swinging it at the iron-bound doors that led into the tower's lower halls. Sparks flew, and soon the doors came crashing inward. Cries of alarm rang out from men loyal to Saruman, guards stationed inside Orthanc, but they stood little chance against the bristling horde that had been promised blood for their freedom. Torches lit the corridors with a sullen glow, revealing the fury on the Uruk-Hai faces as they clashed with halberds and swords, driving deeper into Saruman's seat of power. On the walls, more Uruk-Hai archers dispatched any who sought to rush to the wizard's aid, black arrows singing through the air and finding their marks with lethal precision. So swift and relentless was the rebellion that many within Isengard did not even realize the tide had turned before it was too late. At last, Gashluk reached the spiral staircase leading to Saruman's private chamber. Grima Wormtongue cowered in a corner, eyes bulging with fear as he tried to slip away, but a pair of Uruk-Hai seized him, dragging him before their captain. Gashluk stared down at the trembling man, who croaked desperate pleas, promising to serve the Uruk-Hai if they would spare him. The captain sneered, uncertain whether to crush Wormtongue's skull or allow him to live and scurry about like a rat gathering scraps of information. Before Gashluk could decide, a flash of white robes appeared at the top of the stairs. Saruman stood there, staff in hand, fury etched upon his ancient face. "Traitors!" he thundered, voice echoing in the narrow stone corridor. The staff began to glow with dreadful power, and an unseen force hurled half a dozen Uruk-Hai from the staircase. But the wizard, for all his cunning, had not reckoned with the sheer numbers of the horde that had turned against him. A surge of enraged Uruk-Hai stormed the steps, burying Saruman beneath a wave of muscle and steel. He lashed out with magic, causing some to crumple in agony, but they pressed forward undeterred, driven by the momentum of their rebellion. Staff swinging like a furious serpent, Saruman fought with surprising vigor, managing to throw Gashluk back with a roar of command that rattled the very stones. Yet the wizard found himself surrounded at every turn. He shouted curses, promising fiery doom from Mordor if they dared continue this sacrilege. But the Uruk-Hai no longer feared the eye in the east or the White Hand that had once fed them from rancid troughs. They hungered for their own dominion. In a moment of grim triumph, Gashluk hurled his hammer directly at the staff, cracking it with a deafening snap. An explosion of light and shattered would send sparks flying, and Saruman stumbled back, clutching his broken staff in disbelief. This was not the doom he had foreseen, nor the rebellion he had imagined. Powerless and cornered, Saruman tried once more to speak words of persuasion, but even his famed voice failed him amidst the deafening roars of the Uruk-Hai. His attempts at enchantment fell flat, drowned out by the hatred that surged through the hearts of these creatures he had once molded to his will. Gashluk seized him by the collar of his robes, lifting him off the ground, and in the wizard's eyes flickered a spark of genuine terror. In a final display of defiance, Saruman spat curses, declaring that Mordor would avenge him, that Sauron's wrath would be swift and merciless. But the Uruk-Hai had unleashed themselves from those chains of fear, believing, perhaps foolishly, that they could stand against any foe if their will was united. With a growling snarl, Gashluk hurled Saruman down the staircase, leaving the once great wizard broken at the bottom, robbed of his staff, his power, and his pride. Above him stood a legion of Uruk-Hai, their eyes gleaming with a new and savage purpose. Orthanc was theirs now, its mighty spire echoing with the guttural chants of the victorious rebels. In the aftermath, the Uruk-Hai roamed the tower in euphoria, plundering Saruman's hoarded secrets, rummaging through his archives of scrolls and alchemical concoctions. They did not read or comprehend the lore of the Astari, but they recognized the potential of certain powders and liquids to make explosive weapons or potent poisons. Gashluk claimed Saruman's private chamber, smashing the wizard's furniture to splinters, save for the palantir which he could not break and dared not handle for too long. Wormtongue, having pleaded for his life, was allowed to survive under constant watch. He scuttled about offering counsel on the distribution of rations, the forging of alliances, and even the possibility of negotiations with the forces beyond the walls. But the Uruk-Hai leadership, fresh from their conquest, reveled in the knowledge that they owed fealty to none. The White Hand banners were torn down and burned, replaced by crude sigils scratched into metal shields, a black handprint or the snarling maw of an Uruk's face, signifying their new identity. The transformation of Isengard into an Uruk-Hai stronghold was swift and brutal. Its lofty gates, once locked under Saruman's command, were thrown open to welcome roving bands of orcs from the Misty Mountains and stray bands of evil men who sought power. Yet the Uruk-Hai demanded obeisance from all newcomers, establishing a rigid hierarchy where their own kind stood at the top, towering over lesser orcs and men alike. Barracks were expanded, the forges worked without cease, and a black gloom seemed to settle over the land as acres of trees were felled for fuel. Although the Ents had once laid siege to Isengard, flooding its plains in righteous anger, the new regime was savvier in their dealings with Fangorn Forest. Gashluk ordered that no large-scale assault on the forest be made without careful thought, for he knew that angering the Ents in full force might be their undoing. Still, the ground shook beneath the relentless march of heavy-laden wagons carrying logs and ore, the lifeblood of the Uruk-Hai war machine. Amid this flurry of expansion, rumors trickled in of the War of the Ring raging across Middle-earth. Some whispered that Sauron's armies marched against Minas Tirith, that the Rohirrim rode to Gundor's aid, and that in the east, the Black Gate loomed in ominous readiness. But the Uruk-Hai, newly independent, cast a skeptical eye on these tidings, uncertain whether they should ally with Mordor or stand apart as a sovereign power. In Gashluk's eyes, forging an alliance with Sauron meant exchanging one master for another, an idea that soured in his mouth. He thirsted for a dominion free from the oversight of wizards and dark lords alike, a realm where the Uruk-Hai would reign supreme. Yet the question remained. Could they stand alone in a world bent toward destruction and overshadowed by Sauron's might? For now, they fortified Isengard and cast out any who dared challenge their right to rule these lands. In the ensuing weeks, scouting parties were sent forth from Isengard to evaluate the lands around Rohan and the Gap of Rohan. Led by cunning Uruk-Hai who had once served Saruman as trackers, these squads probed the edges of the Westfold and even skirted the borders of Fangorn, seeking resources and possible alliances with renegade men. Many a village found itself in the crosshairs of the Uruk-Hai's ambitions, though Gashluk was careful not to initiate open war with the Rohirrim just yet. He remembered well how horse-lords fought with a ferocity to rival the Uruk-Hai themselves, and a direct confrontation might weaken their new kingdom before it fully solidified. Instead, the scouts brought back captives, humans, lesser orcs, even the occasional dwarf who wandered too close, herded into the dungeons beneath Orthanc to serve as labor or bargaining chips. But Gashluk's main interest lay in forging alliances with those who despised the kingdoms of men, particularly outlaws or corrupt captains who had deserted their lords. Slowly, a network of informants and willing mercenaries began to form around Isengard, connecting it to the swirling chaos in the east and south. Within Orthanc, laboratories once filled with Saruman's arcane experiments now roiled with the smoke of new concoctions tested by Uruk-Hai alchemists under Wormtongue's reluctant guidance. Though the Uruk-Hai were not learned in the ways of the wise, they grasped quickly the destructive potential of certain powders and chemicals. Crude bombs were fashioned, tested in the deep caverns beneath the fortress, their thunder echoing through the halls and cracking ancient stone. The walls of Isengard were further fortified with cunning traps, pits lined with sharpened stakes, and hidden flues that could spew boiling oil or chemical fire upon any besieging force. A newfound sense of pride welled within the Uruk-Hai ranks, for they had not only wrested their freedom but were now perfecting the arts of war on a scale they had never dreamed possible under Saruman's yoke. Gashluk, in his new throne room, a rough platform erected atop shattered remnants of Saruman's furnishings, received envoys from distant lands who tested the strength of this new power. Some arrived bearing messages from Mordor, speaking in trembling voices of the Dark Lord's might and urging the Uruk-Hai to bend the knee lest they be crushed by Sauron's legions. Others came from minor warlords hoping to strike bargains of mutual gain, offering slaves or precious metals in exchange for the fearsome strength of Uruk-Hai mercenaries. In each case, Gashluk listened, his fiery gaze ever watchful for treachery, for he recalled how Saruman had manipulated his people with honeyed words and hollow promises. He accepted some alliances out of convenience, always ensuring the Uruk-Hai remained in the dominant position, and rebuffed others with a brutal display of force. The ambition that now guided him was a stark reflection of Saruman's own grand designs, albeit wielded by creatures once thought incapable of such cunning. As the Uruk-Hai's dominion spread, the land around Isengard became a patchwork of desolation and rigid order. Slaves toiled in newly established mines, extracting iron and coal to feed the insatiable forges, while overseers barked orders and carried whips made from braided leather and wire. Smoke rose in endless columns, blotting out the sky, and a constant din of hammers and grinding gears filled the air. Yet even as they marveled at their newfound might, the Uruk-Hai could not escape the reality that Middle-earth was vast and brimming with powers both fair and fell. Strange tidings filtered in. Rumors of the One Ring's destruction, of Sauron's tower crumbling into ruin, and of Aragorn, King Elisar, uniting men under a single banner. These whispers made Gashluk uneasy, for though he had declared independence from the Dark Lord and the White Wizard, he knew the forces of light were rallying and might soon cast their gaze upon Isengard. Unwilling to cower behind his walls, Gashluk planned a grand campaign to carve out a territory that extended well into Rohin's outskirts. He reasoned that if the Uruk-Hai could seize the Westfold, they could hold it as a buffer against Gondor and the newly crowned king. His captains, bloodthirsty and eager for battle, approved the strategy, lusting after the spoils they might reap. With swift efficiency, they marshaled armies of Uruk-Hai foot soldiers, warg riders, and conscripted orc archers. In a move that echoed the cunning of Saruman himself, Gashluk hoped to strike before Rohin's riders could muster in full force, aiming to take advantage of the kingdom's partial depletion after the war against Mordor. So the war horn sounded, and the gates of Isengard swung open to unleash a black tide upon the green fields of Rohin once more. The campaign was not without its challenges. Though weakened by the War of the Ring, the Rohirrim still boasted skilled cavalry that clashed with Uruk-Hai raiding parties in skirmishes across the plains. Each clash was a testament to the savage determination of the Uruk-Hai, who fought with an unrelenting hunger, bolstered by a sense of purpose they had never felt under Saruman's rule. In some villages, the men and women stood defiant, recalling the horrors of Helm's Deep and swearing to defend their land to the last. Blood soaked the fields, and even the skies seemed stained with ash as war raged on. Yet the Uruk-Hai pressed forward. For the first time in centuries, Rohan faced not the misguided schemes of a corrupted wizard, but the unified will of a new kingdom forged in rebellion and thirsting for conquest. Back in Isengard, Wormtongue watched events unfold with a mixture of awe and dread. He had survived the downfall of one master only to become a servant to creatures who regarded him as a necessary evil, tolerated only for his administrative skills. He scurried between the fortress corridors and the war councils, always with an armed escort of Uruk-Hai, passing on tidings from the front lines to Gashluk. And in the darkest corners of his mind, Wormtongue harbored a desperate hope to exploit some weakness in the Uruk-Hai leadership. But every time he thought to sow discord or manipulate them as he once did King Theoden, he saw the burning eyes of Gashluk and the resolute unity of the Uruk-Hai ranks, and his courage fled. The tide of battle in Rohan ebbed and flowed with savage intensity. Some Uruk-Hai regiments managed to seize strategic outposts and key crossings along the Isen River, while others were repelled by lightning raids from Ymir's cavalry. Villages were razed, farmland trampled, and both sides paid a steep price in blood. Still, Gashluk pressed on, believing that if he could capture Edoras itself, the victory would be undeniable and the new kingdom of the Uruk-Hai unquestionable. Yet the Golden Hall remained defended by Rohan's bravest knights, and rumor spoke of reinforcements from Gondor moving north, led by men who had witnessed the downfall of Mordor. Aware that an alliance of men might soon converge, Gashluk's ambition burned brighter, fueling a final push deep into Rohirric territory. On a storm-swept dawn, the Uruk-Hai mustered for what they hoped would be the decisive battle, massing before the rolling plains that led to Edoras. Lightning flashed in the distance, revealing silhouettes of war machines the Uruk-Hai had crafted, heavy trebuchets and crude catapults, loaded with jars of flammable liquids gleaned from Saruman's stores. At the forefront stood Gashluk, clad in spiked armor hammered black as night, his brutal hammer held high, leading a throng of Uruk-Hai who roared in unison, the sound echoing like thunder. Across the field, Rohirrim cavalry stood in grim formation, banners snapping in the wind, their faces marked by a mixture of resolve and sorrow. For they knew that the War of the Ring had cost them dearly, and now they faced a savage foe unlike any they had met before, free of any wizard's leash and fueled by their own ambition. Then came the drums and the clash of steel, as the two forces charged, meeting with a crash that shook the very earth beneath them. Amid the chaos of this final clash, the Uruk-Hai displayed the ferocity that had made them feared across Middle-earth. They hurled themselves upon the Rohirrim lines, hacking through spears and slashing at horses. Trebuchets hurled explosive projectiles that burst in blinding flashes, casting the battlefield in a terrifying glow. Rohan's cavalry, swift and disciplined, countercharged, using cunning flanking maneuvers to tear through the Uruk-Hai ranks, lances splintering on iron armor. The valley reverberated with war cries, screams, and the ring of metal on metal. Now and then, Gashluk glimpsed the distant shape of a white horse banner, likely denoting King Ymir himself, riding valiantly through the melee, rallying his knights to hold fast. Neither side relented, each fighting with the desperation of those who know their entire way of life hinges on victory. Then, at the height of battle, a horn sounded from the west, and into the fray rode a contingent bearing the sigil of Gondor. Tall knights with shining plate armor and spears that gleamed in the storm's flashes plunged into the Uruk-Hai flank. Caught between the hammer of the Rohirrim and the anvil of Gondor's reinforcements, the Uruk-Hai lines wavered. Gashluk bellowed orders, trying to rally his troops, but the crush was too great. The newly forged kingdom of Isengard's Uruk-Hai met a resounding challenge from the combined might of men, who had cast aside their old divisions to face a threat that might overshadow the memory of the defeated Sauron. The field descended into a swirling nightmare of limbs, blades, and thunder, as the storm above seemed to echo the fury of the conflict. When the battle's fury subsided, the field was strewn with bodies, horse and Uruk-Hai alike. While the Rohirrim and Gondorians suffered heavy casualties, they stood victorious beneath the battered banners of their houses, forming ranks around their leaders, tending to the wounded, and dispatching any Uruk-Hai too injured to fight back. Of the Uruk-Hai host, only a scattering of survivors limped away, retreating toward the distant shape of Isengard, black clouds looming behind them. Gashluk lay amidst the carnage, pinned by a broken war machine. Wormtongue, skulking in the rear of the Uruk-Hai ranks, had fled at the first sign of defeat, hoping to find a way out of the chaos. As the victors surveyed the battlefield, they saw that the Uruk-Hai rebellion, so nearly a new and dire threat, had been broken in a single, titanic struggle. In the weeks that followed, King Eomer and his allies moved cautiously toward Isengard, expecting a final stand from the Uruk-Hai entrenched there. Yet the fortress, robbed of its main army, seemed strangely quiet when they arrived. Small pockets of Uruk-Hai remained, sullen and desperate, fighting to the last man from behind barricades and traps, but they were swiftly overwhelmed by the combined might of Rohan and Gondor. Orthanc itself stood tall and unyielding, but within its dark halls, the flicker of torches revealed that the seat of the new kingdom had been hollowed out by defeat. Saruman was long gone, carried away by the mysteries of fate, and Wormtongue's whereabouts were unknown, leaving only the echo of the rebellion in corridors steeped with the stench of death. The victorious men secured Isengard, though its destiny remained uncertain. Some spoke of tearing it down, while others believed it should be preserved as a watchful bastion. And so the brief but terrible chapter of Uruk-Hai independence came to an end. In their rebellion, they had shown that creatures bred for darkness could still yearn for a form of agency, even if it was born from violence and tyranny. They had seized Isengard, toppled a mighty wizard, and forged a kingdom of iron and fear in the shadow of the misty mountains. Yet they could not escape the grand tides of Middle-earth's fate, shaped by alliances and hopes far older and deeper than their own cunning. The land around the fortress bore the scars of their ambition: burned forests, razed villages, and an undercurrent of dread that would linger in the hearts of men. Though their reign ended swiftly, the memory of Uruk-Hai banners snapping in the wind over Orthanc stood as a warning to those who would toy with creating life solely for war. In the aftermath, tales of the Uruk-Hai rebellion took root in hushed murmurs across Middle-earth, told by campfires as cautionary legends. Some saw tragedy in the rise and fall of these creatures, shaped by dark hands yet longing to shape their own destinies. Others saw only monsters, abominations that deserved no mercy. But in hidden corners, in Orcish hovels and among roving bands in the wild, the story lived on in whispered hopes that perhaps one day, another chance would arise for the downtrodden minions of fallen lords to cast off their chains. In the annals of the Free Peoples, the rebellion was recorded as a brief but ominous footnote to the War of the Ring, proof that darkness had many shapes, and the thirst for power could erupt in the most unexpected places. And in the silent halls of Orthanc, as the wind howled through shattered windows, one could almost hear a faint echo of Uruk-Hai chants, mourning the kingdom that might have been.